My name is Marcus Thompson, and this is my story. A story I've never told anyone, not completely, but I think it's time people knew what really happened inside those concrete walls and how I found the only way out. Growing up in Detroit's East Side wasn't easy. The year was 2003, and the city was bleeding jobs faster than water through a broken dam. My neighborhood was a graveyard of abandoned houses and shattered dreams. The only sounds you'd hear after dark were sirens wailing in the distance and gunshots echoing between the empty buildings. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on our table, cleaning offices downtown during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store in the evenings, and doing laundry for wealthy families on weekends. She'd come home exhausted, her hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh chemicals, but she never complained. Not once. I was 17 when everything started falling apart. The auto plant where my father had worked for 15 years shut down, taking with it the last hope our community had for legitimate employment. Dad started drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time. Mum's health began deteriorating from the stress and overwork. I watched her grow thinner each week, her beautiful smile fading into something hollow and desperate. That's when Rico approached me. Rico Martinez was the kind of guy who always had money in his pocket, drove a nice car, and wore clothes that cost more than my family made in a month. He'd grown up 3 blocks from me, but unlike the rest of us, he'd found a way out of poverty, though not a legal one. Rico ran drugs for the East Side Serpents, one of the most powerful gangs in Detroit. He knew I was desperate, knew my family was drowning, and he offered me what seemed like a lifeline. "Just drive, Marcus," he'd say, counting stacks of cash like it was nothing. "1 hour of your time, $500 in your pocket. Your mama won't have to work herself to death anymore." I told myself it was temporary, just until Dad found another job, just until Mum's medical bills were paid off, just until we could get back on our feet. But the money was too easy, too good, and before I knew it, I was in deeper than I'd ever imagined. What started as driving packages from one corner to another escalated into bigger operations. Soon, I was running cocaine from Detroit to Chicago, carrying guns across state lines, and participating in territorial disputes that left blood on the streets. The culture of the gang was intoxicating in its own twisted way. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I mattered. We had our own language, our own codes, our own twisted sense of family. Rico became like an older brother to me, teaching me how to read the streets, how to spot undercover cops, how to survive in a world where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. But it all came crashing down on a cold November night in 2005. We were moving a large shipment of heroin from our warehouse to a distribution point across town. I was driving the lead car with Rico riding shotgun when we hit a police roadblock. It wasn't random. Someone had tipped them off. In the chaos that followed, shots were fired. Rico didn't make it out of that car alive, and I found myself staring down the barrel of a detective's gun with my hands zip-tied behind my back. The trial was swift and merciless. The prosecution painted me as a dangerous criminal who had chosen violence over legitimate work. They showed photos of Rico's body, talked about the families destroyed by the drugs we'd been moving, and presented evidence that painted me as a key player in the East Side Serpents operation. My public defender was overwhelmed, inexperienced, and frankly, didn't seem to care much about my case. When the judge sentenced me to 25 years at Riverside Correctional Facility, I felt my soul leave my body. Riverside wasn't just a prison, it was a concrete hellscape designed to break men's spirits. Located 200 miles north of Detroit in the middle of rural Michigan, it was surrounded by endless forests and farmland. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and the closest major city was over 100 miles in any direction. The facility housed over 3,000 inmates in conditions that would make medieval dungeons look luxurious. My first day inside, I learned the rules quickly. Keep your head down, mind your own business, and never show weakness. The guards treated us like animals, and frankly, After a few months inside, many of us started acting like animals. Violence was a daily occurrence. Men fought over everything: food, cigarettes, respect, territory within the prison walls. The gang affiliations from the outside world followed us inside, creating a complex web of alliances and enemies that could shift without warning. I was assigned to Cell Block D, a 4-story concrete tower that housed the most dangerous inmates. My cellmate was a man named Jerome Washington, a lifer who'd been inside for 18 years. Jerome was in his 50s, built like a tree trunk, and had survived more riots, stabbings, and attempted murders than anyone had a right to. But he was also intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly philosophical about his situation. "This place ain't about rehabilitation, young blood," Jerome told me during my first week. "It's about warehousing. They put us in here and throw away the key, hoping we'll just disappear from society's memory. The only way to survive is to find something to live for, something to keep your mind sharp while your body rots in this concrete tomb." The routine was soul-crushing in its monotony. Wake up at 5 a.m. to the sound of buzzers and shouting guards. Roll call. Breakfast of watery oatmeal and stale bread. Work detail. I was assigned to the prison laundry, where I spent 8 hours a day in suffocating heat, washing the clothes and linens of 3,000 men. Lunch, more work, dinner, an hour of recreation time in the yard if we were lucky, then lockdown until the next morning. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with no end in sight. But it was the psychological weight that nearly broke me. Being locked in a small concrete cell for 14 hours a day does things to your mind that are hard to describe. The walls seemed to close in a little more each night. I'd lie on my thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the concrete, and wondering if this was how I'd spend the next 2 decades of my life. I thought about my mother, about Rico, about all the choices that had led me to this place. The guilt was overwhelming. That's when I started planning my escape. It wasn't a sudden decision, but rather a gradual realization that I couldn't survive 25 years in that place. I'd seen what long-term incarceration did to men. It hollowed them out, turned them into shells of their former selves. I'd watched inmates who'd been inside for decades shuffle through the corridors like ghosts, their eyes empty, their spirits completely broken. I refused to become one of them. Jerome noticed the change in me first. I started paying closer attention to the guards' routines, studying the layout of the prison, observing the patterns of daily life with new intensity. I began volunteering for different work details to gain access to parts of the facility I'd never seen before. I studied the guard towers, counted the fences, and memorized the timing of every shift change. "You're planning something stupid, aren't you?" Jerome asked me one night as we lay in our bunks. I didn't answer, but he knew. Jerome had seen enough desperate men over the years to recognize the signs. "Let me tell you something about this place, Marcus. They built Riverside in 1987, and in all that time, exactly 7 men have attempted to escape. You know how many made it out? 0. They either got shot climbing the fence, captured within hours, or killed by the elements trying to cross that wilderness. This ain't some movie, young blood. This is real life, and real life has consequences." But I couldn't let go of the idea. Over the next 6 months, I developed an obsession with finding a way out. I studied every inch of the prison, every routine, every weakness in their security. I volunteered for kitchen duty to learn about the food delivery schedules. I worked in the library to access outdated maps of the surrounding area. I even got myself assigned to the maintenance crew, which gave me access to parts of the infrastructure that most inmates never saw. That's when I discovered it, the one way out that nobody else had thought of. Riverside Correctional Facility was built on what used to be a mining town. In the early 1900s, there had been copper mines throughout the area, and many of the old tunnels still existed underground. Most had been sealed or collapsed over the decades, but during a maintenance job in the basement of the laundry facility, I found something that made my heart race. A steel grate covering what appeared to be an old mining shaft. I spent weeks researching the history of the area in the prison library. The Riverside Copper Mine had operated from 1903 to 1942 with a complex network of tunnels extending for miles underground. According to the historical documents I could find, the main shaft had been partially filled with concrete when the prison was built, but several of the smaller access tunnels had simply been sealed with metal grates. The grate I'd found was old, rusted, and secured with bolts that had been corroding for decades. More importantly, according to the old mining maps, the tunnel it covered connected to a network that emerged nearly 2 miles away, well beyond the prison's perimeter, in a heavily wooded area near an abandoned farmhouse. But accessing that tunnel would be the most dangerous thing I'd ever attempted. The laundry basement was heavily monitored, with guards making random checks throughout the day. The tunnel itself was completely unknown. It could be flooded, collapsed, filled with toxic gases, or simply too narrow to crawl through. Even if I made it through the tunnel, I'd emerge in wilderness with no supplies, no transportation, and every law enforcement agency in the state looking for me. It was, as Jerome had said, practically suicidal. But it was also the only chance I had. I spent the next 3 months preparing. I started exercising more intensively, building up my strength and endurance for what I knew would be a physically grueling escape. I began hoarding small items that might be useful. A small flashlight stolen from the maintenance shop, plastic bags that could keep things dry, a basic first aid kit assembled from items taken from the infirmary. I studied the guard rotations until I could predict their movements down to the minute. Most importantly, I needed to test whether the tunnel was even viable. This required taking enormous risks. During my laundry shifts, I began loosening the bolts on the grate using a screwdriver I'd stolen from the maintenance crew. It took weeks of careful work, a few minutes at a time, always listening for approaching footsteps. Twice I nearly got caught, having to quickly hide the screwdriver and pretend to be working on one of the washing machines when guards made unexpected rounds. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday in October, I managed to remove the grate completely. The tunnel beyond was dark, narrow, and filled with stagnant air that smelled of decay and rust. I lowered myself just far enough to confirm that it was passable, cramped, dangerous, but not completely blocked. I could see that the tunnel curved away into darkness, following what must have been the original mining route. That night, I told Jerome what I'd discovered. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're talking about crawling through a 100-year-old mine shaft in the dark, with no idea what's waiting for you on the other side. That tunnel could collapse on you, flood with water, or simply end in a wall of rock. And even if you make it out, then what? You'll be a fugitive for the rest of your life." "Maybe," I said, "but I'll be free." Jerome shook his head, but I could see something in his eyes. Maybe admiration, maybe envy, maybe just sadness for what he knew he'd never have the courage to attempt. The night I chose for my escape was November 15th, 2007. It was a Thursday, during the guard shift change that happened at 2 a.m. I'd calculated that I'd have exactly 18 minutes between the time the night guards finished their rounds and the incoming shift began their first patrol. 18 minutes to get from my cell to the laundry basement, through the grate, and far enough into the tunnel that they wouldn't hear me if they discovered the breach. I waited until Jerome was asleep, then quietly gathered my small collection of supplies. I'd managed to save 3 days' worth of food, crackers and peanut butter stolen from the kitchen, water in plastic bottles, and the small flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was all I could carry without being noticed. Getting from cell block D to the laundry facility required moving through 3 security checkpoints, but I'd been studying the guards' habits for months. I knew which cameras had blind spots, which doors were sometimes left unlocked for maintenance crews, and which corridors would be empty during the shift change. The first obstacle was getting out of my cell. The electronic locks were controlled from the guard station, but there was a manual override hidden behind a panel in the wall, something I'd learned during my maintenance work. It took me precious minutes to access the panel and trigger the release. And when the door finally clicked open, the sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the sleeping cell block. I moved through the corridors like a ghost, staying in the shadows, timing my movements to avoid the security cameras. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it could be heard throughout the entire facility. Every sound, the distant hum of ventilation systems, my own breathing, the soft pad of my feet on the concrete floor, seemed amplified in the darkness. The second checkpoint was the main security door leading from the residential blocks to the work areas. This door required a key card, but I'd noticed that the maintenance crews sometimes left their cards in the reader when they were working in the area. It was a violation of protocol, but it happened often enough that I'd been counting on it. When I reached the door, my heart sank. No key card. I was about to turn back when I heard footsteps approaching from the other direction. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing as a guard walked past, carrying a cup of coffee and talking quietly into his radio. He was focused on his conversation and didn't notice me in the shadows. More importantly, when he swiped his key card to pass through the door, he was distracted enough that he didn't properly close it behind him. The door remained slightly ajar, just enough for me to slip through. The laundry facility was dark and filled with the industrial smell of detergent and steam. The machines stood silent like sleeping giants, and my flashlight beam seemed pitifully small in the vast space. I made my way to the basement stairs, each step echoing despite my efforts to move quietly. The grate was exactly as I'd left it, the bolts loose and ready to be removed completely. This was the point of no return. Once I entered that tunnel, there would be no going back. I took one last look around the basement, then removed the grate and lowered myself into the darkness below. The tunnel was worse than I'd remembered. The walls were lined with rotting wood supports that looked ready to collapse at any moment. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else I couldn't identify, something chemical and poisonous. The space was so narrow, I had to crawl on my hands and knees, dragging my small pack behind me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I heard something that made my blood freeze, shouting from somewhere far behind me. They'd discovered my absence. Cell count must have revealed my empty bunk, and now the entire facility would be in lockdown. Guards would be searching every inch of the prison, and it would only be a matter of time before someone checked the laundry basement. I forced myself to move faster, ignoring the pain in my knees and the cuts on my hands from the rough tunnel walls. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the earth like the digestive system of some enormous beast. At several points, I encountered cave-ins that had partially blocked the passage, forcing me to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for my body. The worst moment came when my flashlight began to flicker and dim. The batteries were dying, and I was still nowhere near the end of the tunnel. In the growing darkness, every shadow looked like a dead end, every sound like approaching guards. I rationed the remaining light, using it only when absolutely necessary to check my direction. That's when I heard the dogs. The sound of barking echoed through the tunnel behind me, distorted and amplified by the confined space, but unmistakably getting closer. They'd brought in the tracking dogs, and somehow they'd picked up my scent. Dogs could follow a trail through that tunnel much faster than I could crawl, and once they found me, there would be nowhere to run. I pushed forward desperately, my knees bleeding, my hands raw, my lungs burning from the toxic air. The tunnel began to slope upward, which I hoped meant I was getting close to the surface. Behind me, the barking was getting louder, more excited. The dogs had definitely found my trail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw something that made me want to cry with relief, a faint patch of grey light ahead. The tunnel was ending, opening into what looked like a larger chamber. I crawled faster, ignoring the pain, focused only on reaching that light. I emerged into a cave-like opening that had been carved out of the hillside. The old mining equipment was still there. Rusted pulleys, rotted wooden beams, pieces of machinery that had been abandoned for decades. But more importantly, I could see the night sky through a gap in the rocks above. Fresh air flowed into the chamber, carrying the scent of pine trees and rain. The climb out of the mine shaft was treacherous. The walls were unstable, and several times I nearly fell as handholds crumbled under my weight. But adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I had. And finally, I pulled myself up through the opening and collapsed on the wet ground outside. I was free. For the first time in over 2 years, I was breathing free air, feeling real wind on my face, seeing an open sky above me. The sensation was overwhelming. I actually began to cry, something I hadn't done since the day I was sentenced. But I couldn't stay there. The dogs were still coming, and once they reached the end of the tunnel, the guards wouldn't be far behind. I gathered my remaining supplies and began moving through the forest, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mine entrance. The next 48 hours were the most terrifying of my life. I moved only at night, hiding during the day in dense thickets and abandoned buildings. The forest was crawling with search teams, state police, federal marshals, tracking dogs, and even helicopters with searchlights that swept through the trees like giant mechanical eyes. I had no food after the first day, no clean water, and no real plan beyond staying ahead of the search teams. I was completely exhausted. My body was covered with cuts and bruises, and I was beginning to hallucinate from dehydration and stress. More than once, I considered surrendering. The idea of going back to my cell actually seemed appealing compared to dying alone in the wilderness. But something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just the memory of what it felt like to be truly free, even for a few moments. On the third night, I stumbled onto a back road and saw the headlights of an approaching vehicle. I was so desperate that I almost ran toward it, ready to beg for help regardless of the consequences. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was a police patrol car making routine rounds. I dove into the ditch beside the road and watched as it passed, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw the farmhouse. It was small, old, and appeared to be abandoned. No lights, no signs of life, surrounded by overgrown fields and broken fencing. But it represented shelter, a place to rest and think and plan my next move. I approached carefully, watching for any indication that someone might be living there. The house was indeed empty, but not abandoned. Someone was using it as a seasonal residence, probably for hunting or fishing. There were canned goods in the pantry, clean clothes in the bedroom, and most importantly, an old pickup truck parked in the barn. The keys were hanging on a hook by the door, as if the owner had never imagined someone might need to steal his vehicle. I spent 3 days in that farmhouse, eating real food, sleeping in a real bed, and slowly recovering my strength. I found maps of the area and began planning a route that would take me far from Michigan, far from anywhere the authorities might expect me to go. I also found something else in the house, a box of hair dye and some basic toiletries. I spent an afternoon transforming my appearance, cutting my hair short and dyeing it blonde, growing out a beard, and doing everything I could to look different from the prison photos that would soon be plastered across every news station in the country. On the fourth night, I took the pickup truck and began driving south. I stayed off the highways, using back roads and county routes, stopping only for gas and paying with cash I'd found in the farmhouse. I drove through Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, gradually making my way toward the Gulf Coast, where I hoped to disappear into one of the many small towns that dotted the region. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges of being a fugitive. It was the psychological burden of knowing I could never contact my family again. My mother had no idea what had happened to me. For all she knew, I'd been killed during the escape attempt. The thought of her worrying, of her not knowing whether I was alive or dead, was almost unbearable. But I couldn't risk contacting her. Every phone call could be traced, every letter could be intercepted, every attempt at communication could lead the authorities right to me. I had to accept that Marcus Thompson was dead, and whoever I was going to become would have to live with that loss forever. I ended up in a small fishing town called Cedar Bay on the Louisiana coast. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where a man could get work on the shrimp boats without too many questions being asked about his past. I took the name David Martinez, partly in honor of Rico, partly because it was common enough to blend in. For the first year, I lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face, every police car that drove through town made my heart race with panic. I worked 16-hour days on the fishing boats, sending most of my money to support boat operators who paid in cash and didn't ask for social security numbers or background checks. But gradually, I began to build a new life. I rented a small apartment above a bait shop, made friends with the other fishermen, and slowly started to believe that maybe I really had escaped for good. The work was hard but honest, and for the first time since I was a teenager, I was earning money without hurting anyone. It was in Cedar Bay that I met Maria Santos, a school teacher who had moved to Louisiana from El Salvador to escape violence in her own country. She understood what it meant to start over, to leave everything behind in search of a better life. We found comfort in each other's company, two people trying to build something good from the ashes of their past mistakes. Maria never asked too many questions about my history, and I never pressed her for details about what had driven her from her homeland. We both understood that some stories were too painful to share, that some secrets were necessary for survival. But we also understood that the past didn't have to define the future, that people could change if they really wanted to. Over the next 5 years, I worked to become the man I should have been all along. I got my GED through correspondence courses, learned to read and write Spanish so I could communicate better with the Latino community that had welcomed me. I started attending the small Catholic church in town, not because I'd found religion, but because it gave me a sense of community and purpose I'd never experienced before. Most importantly, I learned to forgive myself. The guilt of my crimes, the pain I'd caused Rico's family, the anguish I'd put my mother through, all of it had been eating me alive for years. But Maria helped me understand that self-destruction wasn't the same as atonement, that the only way to truly honor the people I'd hurt was to become someone worthy of their forgiveness. In 2013, 6 years after my escape, I received news that changed everything. My mother had died. I learned about it through an old friend who posted about the funeral on social media. She'd passed away from cancer, alone, never knowing what had happened to her son. The guilt nearly destroyed me. I'd spent 6 years building a new life, while she'd spent 6 years wondering if I was alive or dead. That night, I seriously considered turning myself in. The life I'd built suddenly felt hollow, meaningless compared to the pain I'd caused the one person who'd loved me unconditionally. But Maria talked me through the darkness, helped me understand that destroying my new life wouldn't bring my mother back, wouldn't ease her suffering or honor her memory. Instead, I decided to live in a way that would make her proud. I started volunteering at the local community center, teaching literacy classes to immigrant workers. I helped organize food drives for struggling families. I became the kind of person my mother had always hoped I could be, even if she'd never get to see it. The years passed quietly. The massive manhunt for Marcus Thompson gradually faded from the news. New crimes captured public attention. New fugitives became the focus of law enforcement resources. I was still technically wanted, but I was no longer a priority. As long as I stayed quiet, stayed out of trouble, and kept my head down, I could probably live out the rest of my life as David Martinez. But the real freedom wasn't just being out of prison. It was being free from the person I used to be. The scared kid from Detroit who'd thought crime was his only option was gone, replaced by a man who understood that every choice has consequences, that every action ripples outward in ways we can't predict. I'm telling this story now because I'm dying. Cancer, just like my mother. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months left, and I've decided that I don't want to take these secrets to my grave. Maria knows the truth now. I told her everything last month, and she stood by me just like I knew she would. She understands that the man who escaped from Riverside isn't the same man she's been living with for the past 10 years. I want people to understand that there's always another choice, always another path. The kid I was thought crime was the only way to help his family, the only way to matter in a world that seemed determined to grind him down. But I was wrong. There are always alternatives, always legitimate ways to build a life worth living. Prison Break, one way to freedom. That's how I think of my story. But the real Prison Break wasn't crawling through that tunnel, wasn't escaping from Riverside Correctional Facility. The real Prison Break was escaping from the mindset that had put me there in the first place, from the belief that I was trapped by my circumstances, that I had no choice but to be a criminal. The tunnel I crawled through was dangerous, terrifying, and nearly killed me. But it led to something I never expected to find: redemption. Not just freedom from physical walls, but freedom from the mental chains I'd been carrying my entire life. To anyone out there who thinks crime is their only option, who believes they're trapped by poverty or circumstances, or bad choices they've already made, you're wrong. There's always another way. It might not be easy. It might require sacrificing everything you think you want, but there's always a path towards something better. The price of my freedom was enormous. I lost my family, my identity, my entire past. I can never go home, never visit my mother's grave, never be the son she deserved. But I found something else: peace, self-respect, a life worth living. That in the end was the only way to freedom that mattered.